And there we are. All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you all for joining us for the Ghost Show. And we start off, as always, with our theme. That you will recognize, of course, is the theme from Dracula and the Temple of Funk. One of my favorites. I just made up.
This is classy.
Yeah, it's definitely a theme.
It is,
and it definitely sets a tone.
That was a gift from my partner Mike Lafferty, who knows my taste in movies, and I think I said to him like you have gifted me the least appropriate theme for what I do, and I could not love it. So there we are. All righty, and here we are. Thank you everybody for joining us again. This is the Ghost Show podcast. I'm Professor Christopher McLaughlin. I'm the creative pit boss at Ghost Show Press, which has many perks and none greater than the fact that I get to work with three extremely talented gentlemen like the people that are joining us today. And believe it or not, these three amazing people are back for a second volume in our Everyone's Gone to the Movies series, Volume 2, Subversive Sci-Fi, which is kickstartering now on Kickstarter. And as you may know, by American law, and I do believe international law at this point, I am obligated to drop the Kickstarter link into the chat. So let me do that before I forget. You know,
the law of the internet.
Yeah, don't want to get the man down on us here. So there you go. We just cracked the 3,000 mark today. So, hey, before I forget, thank you also to our backers and the wonderful people who made our first book possible.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sure.
And who are making this one possible. Thank you also very, very, very much. And for making this an amazingly stress-free summer for me. This is going much better than forecast. Okay. And another reason it goes so well again is I have very, very talented people working for me like these three gentlemen. So I'm just gonna go around from block to block and give you guys a chance to introduce yourself and working our way around the Brady Bunch grid. Colm, can you introduce yourself and tell folks a little about yourself?
I'm Colm Lundberg. I'm an Irish writer and games designer, mostly by mistake. I don't know how that happened. The day job was working for the government. So, about all those that talk about the man, Chris, you're talking to the man. Thanks for that. But yeah, so I'm kind of a new kid on the block in terms of game designing, in terms of writing as well. But I've been around, as somebody said, it's been 20 years to become an overnight success. I did a love to hate card game with Green Running Press, and I've done some work on Pathfinder and various other kind of RPGs around the place, and there's some secret projects in train that I can't talk about. But yeah, so that's me.
All right.
In a nutshell.
Right.
Oh, secret projects. My name is Eddie Webb. My pronouns are he, him. I have been also working in the game industry for way too long. But I'm primarily been working on things like Vampire the Masquerade. I've worked on the Red Dwarf role-playing game. I've worked on Cartoon Action Hour. Nowadays, I do a lot of my work with Onyx Path Games, although I still do freelancing for other projects like the recently announced Transformers tabletop role-playing game. I also worked in the video game industry for several years, including the late lamented World of Darkness MMO, may it rest in peace. And I'm mainly really excited about my creator-owned work like the Realms of Pugmire, which is dogs in a post-apocalyptic setting.
Yeah. Yes, but it's more fantasy orientated. So
yeah, it's dogs in D&D. I mean,
yes.
But it happens to be a D&D set in a post-apocalyptic setting.
Yes, but I had an image of dogs in Mad Max for a second, and I may have just.
I mean, you could do that too if you wanted to, but no, it's much more wizards and battle axes rather than laser guns.
Okay. Just, I may have handed you a second $1 million idea there, but. So feel free to run with that one.
I mean, I have been joking with my friends at Artel Saurian about possibly doing cyberpunk Pugmire crossover. The dark future, you know.
All righty. Well, my wife runs upstairs to go ahead and pre-purchase a copy of that. Matthew, please introduce yourself.
So my name's Matthew Dawkins. I'm also a game developer. We get about a bit, don't we? And like Holm, kind of fell into it. Certainly never intended to do this full time, and yet here I am. I write on games. I develop games. I sometimes even edit games under a pseudonym. Along with that, am something of a cinephile. That's a cinephile, and of multiple genres. I guess I'm a bit snobbish when it comes to movies. And yet,
Are you really?
Well, I say that, and then the book I chose for this, the movie I chose for this book is probably the least snobbish sci-fi movie you could go for. So I'm a snobbish proletariat.
You like the idea of being snobbish, but actually being snobbish.
Yeah. I'm working class with a chip on my shoulder. I don't know much about art, but I know what I like. And so
balance.
The games for which I'm most known are probably Vampire the Masquerade, but also the They Came From line, which are cinematic role-playing games by design. They Came From Beneath the Sea, which is 1950s sci-fi. They Came From Beyond the Grave, 1970s hammer horror, gothic horror style stuff. We've got They Came From Camp Murder Lake, which is 1980s slashers. That's my son in the background. And we have more. They came from classified espionage movies and Cyclops' Cave fantasy movies. So yes, very fond of the They Came From line because I love movies.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and another great blessing of having these three gentlemen here is all three of them being game designers is having just gotten out of that racket myself, you find some games where you admire the design, you find other games where you just love the spirit of the thing, and I'm surrounded by three gentlemen who've all done projects very, very close to my mind and my heart. Between Love to Hate and They Came From and Realms of Pugmire, it's like you three you've essentially captured me and my family's heart and soul and mind. So it's amazing to have three.
It's a very strange intersection, but we're glad to corner that market.
Yeah, it's not the most lucrative of markets.
No. Will the right game for
market is down.
But I'm glad to have met my fan.
And customer.
Customer. Yeah.
Dozens
you were the backer.
I'm suddenly reminded of the episode of Mystery Science Theater 3000 where the mad scientists do super specific marketing and they try to sell Mike Nelson brand cigarettes. And they're confronted with the fact that he still won't buy them. Yeah. Well, all right. So I will stop fanishly mocking over you all and give you a chance to talk about the wonderful stuff that you're doing for Subversive Sci-Fi. So how about we go just back around, and Colm, you want to talk about your movie and why you picked it and why it fascinates you so?
Sure. So my movie, The Matrix, the first one. We don't talk about the sequels, not yet. Anyway, leave that for the next books. But no, I mean, when 1999 when I landed, I was kind of between jobs. I hadn't joined the civil service just yet. I just finished a job in a bookstore, and I was starting a job in the library. So books being my life, and books being around. And I went to see The Matrix. And it completely blew me away, not only for the visuals, for the kind of there hadn't been a movie like this as well. But one of my passions is philosophy, and I was kind of watching this movie going, this is Plato. This is Plato. I could recall the pages of the Republic, that this is kind of, and then as I went through the movie, I just kind of fixated on this idea. So I kind of watched it entirely through that lens. Now, obviously, I watched it a few times, trying to suspend that and trying to just enjoy it as a movie and just enjoy the visuals. And that's there as well. But I couldn't get this idea out of my head. So it was almost cathartic writing this, because when you came to me and said, hey, we're doing subversive sci-fi, would you like to write for it? I went, oh my God, I can get this idea out of my head and on paper. It's been bugging me for the last 22 years. I can finally get exercise this demon. But no, and I always read online about the links between the Matrix movie and Descartes and Cartesian doubt, and I'm going, no, it's not. What sort of it is, but it's not really, because that falls short, and it's more Plato. And why don't people say Plato? And there's a couple of people kind of now writing about the links between Plato and the Matrix, which I think is interesting in itself, because you see that more and more of the, the geek culture that we grew up hiding behind lockers in the 80s, supporting, has now become the kind of the mainstream, and the kind of could become so mainstream that people are writing academic papers on the Matrix. They're writing academic papers on Dungeons and Dragons. They're writing academic papers on stuff that that drove us as kids and as young people, but drove us despite of ourselves, if you know what I mean, or despite of the society that tried to deny that. So there's an element of that in it. But yeah, having seen a lot of kind of Cartesian doubt and all that kind of thing, it really kind of struck me that this is the allegory of the cave. The Matrix is absolutely the allegory of the cave, where they're looking at the shadows, and right even down to when they turn around and are blinded by the sun, which is the allegory of the sun in Plato. Neo is blinded because he's never used his eyes, right up to the point of like the hierarchy between what the ideal is in Plato, and then what the perceived is, and then what the belief about the perception is as well. All those kind of things mix in. Even for me, one of the key lines in the Matrix is when Cypher has a steak and he says, "I know the steak is not real, but when I put it in my mouth, I know it'll taste delicious and it'll taste fantastic." And after 9 years, the reality is, I don't want to know. So he's kind of at that lower level of the hierarchy, but it's completely understandable. I mean, the nature of reality has fascinated people for millennia, and still continues to fascinate people. And I think when you're in a situation where the nature of reality is constantly being questioned, from that point of like, is everything in flux, right up to, well, quantum mechanics, yeah, the thing you're seeing, yeah, well, but the fact that you're seeing it now makes it different. You're going, what? And all the signs can now show, obviously, your eyes interpret things and your brain interpret things, and you actually see upside down and your brain flips it, and you're kind of going, what the hell are we? What are we living in here? Like, somebody kind of said, hey, it's the Matrix. I go, oh, that makes sense. Yeah, I can buy that. So as we learn more about the nature of reality, it just opens more and more questions. So I think, so I guess they were the driving forces behind me picking this movie, and the fact that you're asking, I'll do anything for money. No, but seriously, with the driving force, as I said, it was kind of a cathartic to exercise this demon out of my head for the last 20 years, and actually put together the thoughts that were all, the way thoughts kind of bounce around your head and they lack cohesion. They fire off certain random times, and until you actually sit down and write it, the cohesion doesn't happen. And then when you write it, you can go, oh, okay, that's what it was.
Yeah. Yes, indeed, and it was such a joy to read. It's one of those pieces that I want this thing to succeed so that other people will have a chance to read it. It reminded me, in the best possible way, of back when I was a sophomore, junior undergrad, and I was taking political philosophy courses to fill up extra credits on my degree, and I had these amazingly gifted professors, and I could leave class ready. I could feel my brain expanding and kind of beating up against the bottom of my skull, and it eventually led me to make that fateful call home and tell my parents I wasn't going to law school after all. I wanted to study more of this philosophy stuff. Wow, you talk about awkward silences. But yes, but that reading stuff that's teaching you things, you will never be the same after you read it, and you will never look at things the same way. I got that wonderful feeling back after many years of being on the dishing it out side of the whole knowledge game. So just a very good piece of writing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Very honored to publish that.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that.
All righty, and now we're going to shift off to the apocalyptic wasteland of Georgia. And talk to and Eddie. Tell us about your movie.
So I picked Blade Runner because I have very kind of almost idiosyncratic views on cyberpunk. Like, I believe that literary cyberpunk as its at its apex moments was about 3 years in length, and some of that comes from I grew up in kind of a punk subculture, so it's like there's a bit of the punk has a short shelf life kind of by design. As soon as it becomes known, it stops being a thing. Again, once you observe punk, it changes to something else. And everyone talks about how Blade Runner was kind of a big watershed moment for cyberpunk, and it is. I mean, it's one of the seminal cyberpunk works. It's right up there with William Gibson's Neuromancer. It's right up there with Akira. I mean, it's one of the classics, and yet it is almost nothing like the Philip K. Dick material. It is very substantially changed from the original material, and it has been manipulated and edited and tweaked and interfered with in so many different ways that we have all of these kind of different versions of Blade Runner out there, and they all are telling different stories, really. I mean, the same core beats are there, but um, it's meant to be a movie where you kind of like The Matrix, where there's a philosophical undercurrent, and you're meant to kind of think, and there's no easy answers. And yet, at one point in time, there was an easy answer, and that got removed. And then, as new scenes get introduced and other scenes get cut out, it starts to actually change what's being questioned. Whether Deckard is, spoilers for a 30-year-old movie, whether Deckard's actually a replicant or not, or whether, whose other characters are and how they relate to each other. And as more media comes out talking about the intersection between technology and humanity and how we look at technology, how we relate to technology, how it becomes more personal to us, we can keep looking back at Blade Runner and seeing still a very good classic movie, but also, at least in my experience, it keeps changing each time we look at it. So, I mean, I kind of more focused on the fact that here's this weird moment in time where studio interference and audience expectations in '82, where they wanted a big action film, kind of butchered this film, and then we've slowly tried to piece it back together over time. But that moment in time is gone, like Tears in the Rain, if you will. You can't really go back to '82. So the Blade Runner we have now is very much a creature of the early 2000s rather than being an '80s movie. So it's a moment that never really existed. It's interesting to kind of look at how these events all came together in a way that should not have happened. And again, I say I talk more about them, the backstory of like, here's some of the decisions that were made and why they were made and how it relates to source material. But really at the end, this movie should not have worked. And yet not only did it work, but it went on to shape an entire movement of media is just fascinating. I mean, that to me, that's just like peak subversion, right? It's like this kludge of a film, much like Star Wars. It just comes out and then changes the entire landscape, almost certainly by accident.
It always reminds me of that famous line about the first Velvet Underground album, that like only 300 people bought it, but everyone that did went out and started their own band.
Yeah, absolutely. Then there are so many things. Like recently, I've rewatched Akira, but I also rewatched some other mid '80s Japanese anime like Bubblegum Crisis and whatnot. And again, the obvious visual inspirations from Blade Runner are so clear. And even as you look at other media that brands itself as cyberpunk, the tall towers, the prominence of Japanese writing, the neon, the flying cars, that all comes from Ridley Scott. It all comes from that very singular vision. Again, very little of which is actually in the original story. So it's all purely him. And so that one creative vision just set such a strong tone for this subgenre that we look at. So it's really fascinating. You don't have Cyberpunk 2077, the game, without Blade Runner, but there's almost nothing in the middle between those 2 points, which is so interesting.
Yes. And I love what you had to say about it, about the context of it. It did come out in that legendary year of 1982. And to think about it in this context, you realize that, yes, this thing came out at the same time as E.T. and Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and Carpenter's The Thing. And it's not remotely like any of them.
No. I mean, if it had come out like a couple of years later or a couple of years earlier, I think it would have been largely untouched. But it came up at peak action movie era. The late '70s, there was still room for unusual sci-fi properties, especially in the wake of Star Wars, as long as it wasn't science fantasy. But I mean, that right before Star Wars, you could still do interesting, weird sci-fi and find a market for it. And then like in the mid to late '80s, that resurgence, you get Total Recall and you get RoboCop and all of that kind of really subversive sci-fi stuff starts coming after that. But this is, I mean, it's no one quite knew what this was, so it got shoved into the pigeonhole of action film, and that shaped a lot of what it was because it's so nuts. I mean, I talk about it like there's like 3 gunshots in the whole film, and most of them are one-shot kills. I mean, it's a brutal, ugly film in that respect, but yet the studios very much wanted this, and like the fact that it was on TV at one point, there's a TV edit of this is just ridiculous. I mean, it's like there's no way this works edited for television, you know, with commercial breaks. It just doesn't really hold together. But they were trying so hard to find a place for this to fit until the market evolved to where people could go, oh, okay, I now see what that was doing.
All righty. Okay. I'll pay you one final compliment of that. I have just finished off doing my editing pass for 16, 17 manuscripts. And I got to the end of it and I realized that like Eddie is the guy in this volume who wrote about the film that every other essay in the book references.
Oh, really?
Or the other. You know, and even if somebody managed to get one past me, I'm also working on the author spotlights. It's on everybody's list of favorite films.
Mm-hmm.
So I had this image of like everybody grabbing this book and immediately going to your piece. So and they're going to see a very good piece of writing when they get there.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. But I mean, it's easy because honestly, there have been a small amount of extremely landmark sci-fi films. It's Star Wars, it's Blade Runner, it's The Matrix. I mean, and then you got one or two more after that. But I mean, if you go further back, you're looking at things like Godzilla. You know, there are very few sci-fi films that really just completely change direction. So it's not surprising that everyone's like, because I mean, I love Blade Runner too. But again, it's just so weird when you actually look at the context of it, of like, this should have disappeared into obscurity, and you know, no one should have heard it. It's the fact that it's so strong, and it's the core of Dick's writing is definitely there, and the core of Ridley Scott's vision is definitely there, and so I think that carries it through. But when you start looking at it and pulling it apart, it's like this movie just should not work. It does not. It defies every convention.
Yeah, and you do a great job of breaking that aspect of it down, which is just another amazing aspect to it.
Thank you.
And Matthew, you know, and your work, your idea made me smile, because I absolutely love how you took Dawn of the Dead, a film that has been written about and written about and written about and written about, and you still mined so much fresh and valuable stuff from that well-plowed ground, from this somber and horrific on multiple level films, and then for this one you didn't.
This time I just skimmed the surface, and that was
no, not where I was going. And not where I was going. It's like you showed a completely different kind of awesome by doing a completely opposite kind of film. So well,
yeah.
and listen, why don't I let you tell the folks what you picked and why, and then I'll get you.
Well, I mean, it's very much a case of going from the highbrow to the low. When I compare The Matrix, Blade Runner to my movie Flash Gordon, 1980. So let's be specific. This isn't a Buster Crabbe classic. It would probably be unfair to refer to Flash Gordon as trash, because I think Mike Hodges, the screenwriter, actually did a sterling job within the constraints within which he was operating. And Dino De Laurentiis' vision, as eclectic as it is also stunning, vibrant. You can picture Flash Gordon. There is no doubt about it. And it was after I submitted the essay, I was thinking, God, and it was only because I started watching the original Star Wars trilogy with my infant son. I started thinking, and I knew, and I'd already written in the essay that Star Wars, or George Lucas, originally wanted to make Flash Gordon, and this was dragged through hell until he said, right, I'm just doing A New Hope, I'll make my own, I'll make Star Wars instead. But you can very easily see how the Star Wars trilogy, the original, it is Flash Gordon. It's Flash Gordon. You've got forest planets and forest people. You've got ice planets and ice people, Cloud City without Voltan and so on. Basically, I should have written an essay about how Star Wars should just be Flash Gordon. But I didn't do that. Instead, I think I tried to convince the reader that Flash Gordon is actually the best science fiction movie ever made. And I realized that's a tall order for most people, because it has a veneer, a thick one, of garishness and soap opera, space opera. It doesn't have the strongest cast in the world. The plot is very much by numbers. And in a sense, what the conclusion I came to when I was writing the essay was Flash Gordon is the archetypal space opera sci-fi movie. In that, if it had been released 4 years prior, before A New Hope, it probably would have been, well, I think, applauded a lot more than it was, because A New Hope does what Flash Gordon does 3 years before Flash Gordon, and a lot better in terms of visuals at the very least. But I think it's very easy, and this is the kind of thing I explore when talking about Flash Gordon, to write it off as cheap and farcical and Sam J. Jones. It's just wooden. And it isn't. There's a hell of a lot I find to adore about Flash Gordon, whether it's the excess that basically makes it the sci-fi version of Caligula, complete with the Italian studio, well, it's Italian studio funding, but Italian studio interference that comes with it, or whether it is absolutely pitch perfect performances by Max von Sydow and Peter Wingard, Timothy Dalton, and Brian Blessed, of course. Everyone sort of looks to Brian Blessed when they think of Flash Gordon, and I think it's with good reason. There's a purity to it, just a pure vein of enjoyment that runs through it. It doesn't ask you to think too deeply about the subject matter. And some movies are ideal for light entertainment, and in that regard, I think Flash Gordon really nails it. There isn't a huge amount beneath that, beyond the stories that went into the making of it, which is where the movie gets really quite interesting. When you look at the scale of Flash Gordon, a lot of people, I think, can very easily picture the throne room with the cast of vastly different costumed extras, and Flash and Dale and Zarkov being marched up to Ming the Merciless. The scale of that throne room, it matches, in fact, it exceeds the hangar in Empire Strikes Back, with all the stormtroopers. That was famously done. That was innovative at the time. Not so for Flash Gordon. We all just hire 300 people to stand in a room in ridiculous costumes. And they improvised the football fight. The famous football fight was even in the script. It was just, this is boring. What shall we do to make it fun? And the cast came up with it. Again, it's pure, it's simple, and yet the stakes in it, both plot-wise and financially, are massive. Because so much is being poured into what is on one level a vanity project, is on another an art film, because when the rocket is soaring into space, you are basically looking at works of oil in water art. It's experimental in its soundtrack. You start again digging down into it, and the tragedy, I think, of Flash Gordon is that thick veneer of light entertainment is impossible for the actual innovations to break. It is easily comparable to the best parts of Star Wars, which again isn't terribly deep entertainment, but it can never get through that surface. And so, I find it fascinating to watch and think, that's fun. Read about, and then watch it again and think, oh, I can actually see what they were going for there. Is that a miss, or is it actually ideal that you don't see what's going on behind the curtain? So in short, I think Flash Gordon is a hell of a lot of fun. I don't know many people that would disagree with that. Is it the best movie I've ever made? Probably not. Is it the most fun sci-fi movie ever made? I think there's an argument that it could be. And I think features that are fun as well as thought-provoking deserve to be critically acclaimed for such. And they often aren't. Eddie, you were obviously talking about Blade Runner standing on its own. The Matrix as well. Sci-fi is a genre that gets viewed so poorly, probably worse than horror, which is a tall order again. But sci-fi and comedy, they rarely get critically praised. It's changing to a degree now, with the Christopher Nolans of the world. There are more auteurs, vocal auteurs behind them. But The Matrix is very much a punctuation point in a decade. It stands out. And Blade Runner, very much the same. Flash Gordon, not at all. And I don't know that that's fair. Because just because it doesn't have a deep message doesn't mean it's not a good movie. But still, the reviews of the time, very much mixed. Some people thought it was bad. Some people thought it was great fun. And I think it's always better when your media gets a division of this is awful and this is fantastic than, well, this is all right. I'll forget about this tomorrow.
Well, and really, your writing did such a great job of making me as the reader go back and take another look at that movie. And I love how you're very, very honest about where Sam J. Jones and Melody Anderson are. I mean, they're almost making a different movie than the rest of the cast. You really had me thinking about, wait, does this film get better if you got a better actor in that part? And it's
So I guess, let's a bit of mental gymnastics. Imagine Mark Hamill and Carrie Fisher in those two roles. Would it make it any better? And I don't know, to my taste, and I suppose it is a very much a subjective thing, I kind of enjoy Flash Gordon being a rather thick-skulled quarterback rather than a polo player with quips and answers. It makes for a different kind of viewing experience, especially for 1980, because it means everything else is in orbit around him as he's very much on a sort of roller coaster ride through the story that he doesn't affect a great deal until he crashes a ship. That's basically his agency. He crashes a ship. But it's a good point. By no means do I think they're the worst actors in the world. I mean, hell, there are far worse who have been in far worse. But I think they stand out as so wooden or so ill cast for this movie because of how hammy almost everybody else is.
Well, I've always kind of thought that, I don't know if it was intentional, but I think I'm with you. I like it because they are the quote unquote normal characters. There are viewpoint characters into the story, and all of the alien characters to us are over the top. And so when you put anyone next to Brian Blessed, right, you're gonna get acted out of the room, perhaps literally.
They will get devoured.
Right. So I mean, it's almost like Rocky Horror Picture Show, right? Where it's the same thing. It's like, those two viewpoint characters are a little dull and wooden because that helps to juxtapose against the sheer lunacy of the setting that they're being thrust into.
Yeah.
But even if you look at the older movies, going back to the 1920s, and when you mentioned kind of Caligula, when you had those kind of those epic movies like Ben-Hur and like, Julius Caesar with these casts of thousands, I mean, and you have the kind of the central characters being focused on with this backdrop of many people, you're not typically interested in the performance of the central characters. You're just taking a step back and you're experiencing the whole as a kind of a shock and awe kind of cinematic experience as well, I think.
That's a really good example, and using someone like Kirk Douglas as an example, by no means the most emotive actor. Hell of a screen presence. I mean, people might say the same thing about Charlton Heston as another screen icon. I like a lot of Charlton Heston performances, but again, there's outside of Wayne's World 2, there's not much emotional range.
Wow.
Which is obviously his best performance.
For sure.
Apparently.
And the other thing I thought about to put the acting in perspective is Flash Gordon has been unfavorably compared to Star Wars from the day that I walked out of the theater in 1980.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think if it's possible to watch the original 1977 Star Wars with objective eyes, if that's even possible at this point.
Yeah.
And with much love for Carrie Fisher and Harrison Ford, if we're going to be fair here, Hamill and Ford and Fisher are doing one thing, and Peter Cushing and Sir Alec Guinness are doing something else there.
Yeah.
There's a similar disconnect there.
People have said for a long time that Alec Guinness and Harrison Ford more or less carry that movie. The first one, especially, episode 4, I guess. And yeah, I watched it again, as I mentioned, with my 5-year-old, and he picked up on all of the beats. Darth Vader's the bad guy. He asked, "Is that the bad guy?" Well, yeah, clearly this black and white universe is doing its job. But the one thing I noticed, as well as, God, a lot of the extras are ugly in that movie. And I mean that in a very 1970s British extra. They just walked onto the set of Pinewood or Elstree or whatever. So they've all got sideburns. They all look like they've crawled out of a mine somewhere. And I can't put it all down to, well, he's in the Empire, so he has to look grim. This is the rebels who are sat there in the corridor at the beginning as well. Darth Vader's doing them a favor. But Mark Hamill and Carrie Fisher, sadly, I know it's sacrilege to say it now, because actors grow. We know actors grow, actors develop. Keanu Reeves in The Matrix is a fantastic example of this. It's de rigueur to say Keanu Reeves is a wooden actor, and he's not.
Dude,
he is excellent in several performances, and sometimes, it's the famous one is Point Break. Dude, I've got to go undercover as a surfer. Who's gonna believe me? That's totally bogus. Because he's supposed to be some ex-Marine or something. No, this is the ideal role for you, Keanu. But Mark Hamill and Carrie Fisher in A New Hope, they're very young. They're not, they haven't been put through their paces yet, and so they play Flash Gordon and Dale in a sense. And it's one note. And it gets better with each of the next 2 movies, arguably, or at least the next one. But it's an unfair comparison, I think. Really, Flash Gordon Star Wars. I see why it's made, but the critical element is special effects, and that's all it comes down to for me. In Flash Gordon, you can basically still see the strings. In A New Hope, 3 years prior, this is unlike anything I have ever seen before, or for the next X number of decades.
Yeah.
Right. And honestly, I think that's fair. Is you mentioned before, if this had come out earlier, it would be praised differently. And I think that's very true. I mean, De La Rente definitely came from an older school of filmmaking, and basically it sounds like someone came to him and said, make a Star Wars, and he's like, okay, cool, great, and used his 50s and 60s style of movie making to make that film. And so, like you said, the large sets, let's throw lots of extras in here. That gives a sense of scale and grandeur that the much lower budget Star Wars found different ways around. And that ended up signposting a new way to kind of basically do films. But I think you're right. If you look at this stuff critically, I mean, even let's go to The Matrix. I mean, we're picking on Keanu a bit here, but I mean, I think intentionally Keanu's character is meant to be a bit wooden in one note,
Mhm.
because he's supposed to be the everyman. If we should be able to see ourselves slotted into his role, whereas all the other characters are much more outlandish, not to Flash Gordon levels, but I mean that's not their role, right? But they're fitting certain archetypes, which is the tough chick, the sassy leader, the sassy support person, the calm, intellectual leader. These are all very strong archetypes that, for the conceit of the film, need to stay archetypal. It's only a couple of characters that actually get a proper arc, and those are the characters that actually have agency in this world. So I've often suspicious when people are like, well, this acting is bad, because usually I hear my code for I didn't like it, which is not the same thing. Sometimes there are performances that people love. They're not good performances, and there are performances that are terrible or that are great, but people just don't get.
And you're right about the one note thing fascinates me, because I mean we were saying about the Matrix there. I mean, Morpheus is Obi-Wan. Trinity is a combination of Leia and Harrison Ford. And so yeah, absolutely. But the one note thing is really interesting to me, because I think what matters in those situations is the canvas against which that note is echoing the rest of the orchestra. Because if the note, if the echo chamber that note is in isn't interesting, isn't rich, isn't developed, isn't presented well, then the note will ring hollow. But if the note if the echo chamber has bells, whistles, and lasers flying off everywhere in action and beautiful graphics, it will be more appealing instantly to an audience. And I think that's where Flash Gordon particularly has a challenge, because the echo chamber is epic, but it's not hyper studio polished. And that for me, that's part of the charm. That's one of the reasons I love the movie. I love that it's raw, and it's I mean, you can see almost see the improvisation. You can see like people falling over in the background. It's brilliant for that. But it's not kind of polished in the way that makes a movie instantly acceptable to an audience, instantly attractive to an audience.
Well, I think that idea of polish or lack of it is something I particularly enjoy about The Matrix. It's the fact that not only do we again have two very new creators on the big stage, it's something as simple to me as destructible environments. Bullets that are making bits of rock or bits of tile fly off, and you're able to see the powder, the dust. It makes it look rough. It makes it look grungy, which is absolutely perfect for a martial arts sci-fi movie, because again, how many had done that before then? But it also takes it out of most viewers' comfort zone. It makes you sit up, because you are used to every gunfight, short of Total Recall, which I think you mentioned earlier already, and other Verhoeven movies. In fact, RoboCop. Thinking about it, Verhoeven is probably the only sci-fi director who was having big gunfights where the world was collapsing around the characters as a result. The sets are being torn down by this weaponry. And it's really stunning, because again, you don't just focus on the characters in The Matrix. You're focusing on the world, because the world is so rich. And that it makes for a wholly immersive viewing experience, unlike many others, quite frankly. And that, I think, it's in large part where it stands up so well even today.
But you're right, and that's where sequels sometimes fall down, because sequels enter this space of, okay, we now have all this money because they're so successful. Let's load the budget on special effects, and they end up being so polished and so kind of glossy. And it's like the difference between a comic book we would have picked up in the 80s and devoured to a full glossy kind of Heat magazine on the top shelf. It's that kind of that disparity, that kind of difference between something which is hyper polished to the sense that to the level that it loses meaning.
The Thing compared to the Thing prequel. Or remake, whatever, where they chose to use CG. They were going to use practical effects in the prequel, And so a lot of people got very excited because they thought one of the things we really love about John Carpenter's The Thing is how practical everything looks. And at some point, the studio decided these don't look real enough. We're going to use practical effects with augmented CG, or we're just going to use CG in other cases. And it makes it look cheap and studio built, and well, not cheap is probably, I guess, the ironic word in that sense, because it's not. It probably costs more.
Well, yeah, and I mean, like, go back to Star Wars. I mean, that's the archetypal example, right? Like the 3 prequel movies had much more money into them, were much more polished, and were generally frowned upon. I mean, I generally try to defend the prequels. I think there's more validity to them than a lot of people give credit for, but it's hard to compare. And then we look at the modern Star Wars output of a million things, but they've largely gone back to practical effects because they recognize that there's a verisimilitude there that you just can't really duplicate. But I mean, even then, you're talking before about how Flash Gordon is kind of not respected, and I think it's definitely a movie that has grown into respect over the decades. But also, I think it's because, frankly, Americans haven't really appreciated camp until relatively recently, and Flash Gordon is camp. It's straight up camp, and Star Wars isn't. So I mean, it's really easy to slide to camp. If you look at the original serials, I mean, they're pretty campy, and De Laurentiis, coming from a European background, probably is like just slid into camp and actors. Okay, cool, just do this. And American audience is like, what is this? It's silly. Is it a satire? Is it a comedy? I don't quite get it. And camp is none of those things. It's only been over time that I think the American audience is going, oh, okay, I get now what this is trying to do. It's not meant to be a satire. It's meant to be much more loving than that. But we can also laugh at it, and that's okay. It's not bad that we're laughing at it. But I think it really, frankly, took Mystery Science Theater for Americans to really appreciate what camp actually is.
Well, long term, Flash Gordon is definitely a film that shows in its DNA that it was written by the main writer for the Adam West Batman show.
Okay. That's true. I mean, Batman's probably the only other thing that Americans have had that resembles camp. That's a fair point.
It's interesting when you talk about to go back to that, because when you were, and to segue into fantasy for a minute, if I may, when you're talking about the polished and the unpolished, the Harryhausen effect. That's what I call it in my mind, But it's interesting when you talk about camp in European theaters, because we did camp. European cinema did camp wrong. It did camp offensively to a large, a lot of kind of in a way that Flash Gordon I don't think does. I think Flash Gordon is almost accidentally camp without being intentionally misogynistic or intentionally, anti a group of people with his campness. I think that's where the challenge of the European theater, I think.
That's a really good point, but I just think Americans didn't have the language to understand it.
Sure.
And so it's like, I don't know how to react to this. Whereas you're right. I mean, it's perfectly fair. The camp has evolved, particularly in the past 30 or 40 years. And I think some of that is probably due to more globalization. People are seeing each other and recognize, there's some commonalities here. But I mean, to Chris's point, I mean, Batman is kind of a really good early attempt at American camp. Police Files is probably another kind of, Naked Gun. That whole genre is kind of another. It's slapstick, but it's starting to edge backwards into it. But you're right. Flash Gordon's a really good example of here's how to do it right. But I think it was just, again, wrong time slot. I think it just the audience just weren't quite ready for it. But if 5 years later, I think they probably could have.
And something you guys were talking about how the special effects in the Matrix were such a critical element, and it reminded me of tying several things we've been talking about together. Is in one of my favorite essays in transgressive horror was our friend Abe Smith, who wrote about Carpenter's Thing, and one of the great points he made about it is that Carpenter's Thing is a contemporary of Ray Harryhausen's Clash of the Titans. I saw them both in the theater, and it was a reminder, like, wow, that was actually the same element in my life, same time frame in my life. And he makes the great point that the Thing is kind of the last time. This is, you will never be able to do another movie based around stop motion and creatures anymore. After The Thing, there's no going back to cheap creature effects. And it was so funny that this film that that I think Abe argues very well sets this unbreachable barrier for acceptable special effects, that its prequel, remake, unmake, whatever that thing was, fell, now the level of special effects that were programming A2 are now unacceptable to a studio.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the remarkable things about The Thing is not just the incredible quality of the special effects, and I would put Gremlins up there as a latter movie that does practical effects incredibly well in that sort of horror sci-fi genre. A lot of the reason The Thing works is, of course, down to John Carpenter's directing. Unfortunately, I can't name cinematographer or director of photography or the like on that movie, but people picture in their mind, and you famously, a lot of people have done this with The Exorcist. They picture scenes that they never actually saw. And like the crab walk backwards down the stairs is a deleted scene. And I think it's been reinserted in some cuts, but so many people had seen the still of it that they were sure that they'd seen it. The face of Pazuzu, which was added later and so on. But in The Thing, people have a picture in their mind of what The Thing looks like sort of writ large, except almost every single shot is cut in some way. You rarely get to see the whole thing because it's being puppeteered just off screen. The dog thing is a very good example of that. The shots are so close up. All you really get to see is the twisting sort of rose thing that opens up and the dog tongues that are hanging out of it and all that. You can't actually see what's going on. You don't know what this thing looks like. It is beyond the borders of the screen until the very end, and arguably it's the Blair thing at the end that looks the worst. That's the weakest effect in the entire movie, because suddenly it is going Ray Harryhausen. Suddenly it is a Cyclops sort of thing lumbering about. And yeah, you get to the Matrix and effects in that. And that is another sort of epochal sci-fi moment where effects have changed. They have just completely snapped. Boom. It's now you've set a tone that's got to be hit in everything from Looper to Oblivion to Elysium to everything that follows, whether it's generic sort of Tom Cruise, Matt Damon sci-fi, all the way up to more experimental stuff like Inception or Tenet or whatever. That can all trace its DNA very firmly to the Matrix, and the different way that special effects are shot and constructed, much like, as you say, The Thing sort of holds that flag for the 1980s, especially for monsters, I guess.
I mean, and if we ever do a third volume, and I'm saying we are, but if we are, I mean, I think an analysis of action films would have a very interesting dynamic as well, because similarly, what was constituted an action film now is very different from what was in the early 2000s, from 90s to 80s. The idea of an action film even existing is like that starts around the 80s. I mean, before that being its own genre wasn't really a thing. So it would be interesting to kind of look at that, because I would argue that John Wick has probably done for action films what The Matrix did for sci-fi. John Wick has just completely changed how we think about action films now. And that's a relatively recent film, all things considered, but it was such a huge game changer.
But by comparison, things like The Bourne Identity did the same that Blade Runner did, created this kind of new kind of explosion of how you do things in a very different way, in a very effective way that has been amplified and echoed so many times, but never quite pinned.
Yeah, I mean, Blade Runner is a very mature sci-fi drama, or mystery, if you like, where again, nothing. I'm sure there were other films that tried to tackle a sort of murder investigation kind of thing in a far future dystopia, but I can't think of any off the top of my head. Certainly none that are drawn as carefully as Blade Runner happens to be.
Right.
And yeah, not much has been done with that since to as successful an effect. If anything, I'd say it nowadays. Blade Runner is only really emulated, obviously, other than with its sequel, through TV series like The Expanse, Altered Carbon. Altered Carbon definitely is Blade Runner. But they're only recent offerings. That's a massive gap in time from 1982 to 2012 or whenever The Expanse started.
But I mean, building on Blade Runner, but also going back to movies that missed a moment in time. I mean, the Blade Runner movie sequel that came out. I have argued that Dave Bautista's acting in that film was actually quite good, but he was acting in that late 70s, early 80s, quieter sci-fi vein. Is that you have a much more constrained performance, much more face acting, it's much more small movements. You drop lines to communicate through body language or through cinematography rather than through, just saying the line. And we don't watch films like that anymore. People, again, contemporary Star Trek motion picture, we make fun of the 10-minute Enterprise panning scene at the beginning, but that's how you made movies and built epic natures. I mean, if you look at Star Wars, that shot of the Star Destroyer is also pretty long. We block it out to a degree, but I mean that's still a good solid 2.5 minutes of just looking at a spaceship. So I mean, it's equivalent. We audiences change and evolve, and movies change with them. And so sometimes it's weird to look back at these films and go, "Oh, this is still holds up." And it's like, well, no, it doesn't. It's actually, we're looking at it completely differently. It's just that so much of how we watch movies stems from this film. So many films emulate or draw inspiration from this film so that we're trained to like this film because this is where it all came from. So The Matrix definitely falls kind of in the camp. And again, I keep going back to Flash Gordon because you bring up some points I hadn't really thought of before, in that it's not quite a good fit. If I didn't get Blade Runner, I was going to pitch Transformers the movie, the animated film.
Wow. The animated one?
The animated film, yes.
Okay.
As Eddie just before, with the soundtrack by Lion,
right,
whose only other offering is the music in the background and Friday the 13th Part 6 that Crispin Glover is losing his shit to.
Right. I mean, one of the points I would have argued is, much like Flash Gordon, if you take the music out, the film changes dramatically. And you can't do Queen in a film. I mean, you can now, but I mean, because they built status. But I mean, that particular moment in time, you can't just transpose Queen from their film and make it work. It was very specifically that synergy of that style of music and that style of movie. Same thing, that 80 power ballad thing fits so perfectly with Transformers, and a lot of other animated films around that time just failed because of that one piece. There are other pieces that layer onto that. I mean, I would argue that Transformers movie makes more sense thematically than logically. But I mean, it's one of those things that when you look back and it's like, oh, I mean, I remember loving this film. I watched it recently and it's like, I still love this film, but for completely different reasons than I loved it as a kid. The things that hit me emotionally are hitting me differently now because I'm a almost 50-year-old man and not a 12-year-old kid. But also I've learned a lot as an audience watcher, as someone who's learned to consume media. So, I mean, The Matrix, I think, still works because it set the tone for how movies began built from that template. I think Flash Gordon has grown in respect because people have realized, oh, it was just ahead of its time. We now can look back and see, oh, this is what it was trying to do, and really appreciate and respect the audacity that it had.
It's almost like there's a kind of a duality here between an audience's reduced attention span and need for immediacy versus the counterculture to that, where people are exploring more kind of conceptual, more kind of theoretical, more kind of philosophical, more drawn out movies as a kind of as the counterculture to the kind of the TikTok audience reception, for want of a better term.
Yeah, because right now media consumption has only two modes, which is I opt out in 15 seconds or I binge the entire thing.
Yeah.
But there's a casual audience area that we just don't have anymore.
Mm.
So either I don't care about this at all and do not watch it, or I obsess about this thing and pick it apart.
Mm.
So a movie has to both bring you in immediately and then sustain deep, intricate analysis that audience members just weren't casually doing 20 years ago.
Mm.
Except for, again, you get to the Matrix, and that inspired people to have coffee shop philosophy things. I mean, I would argue that the modern version of the Matrix is The Good Place. The Good Place has also spurred a huge increase in interest in philosophy in a way that Matrix did in '99.
Mm. Mm. Oh, but getting to some great points that you guys have been throwing out. I can barely keep up with you guys. Are so awesome, but yeah, the Transformers soundtrack. I always loved how Paul Thomas Anderson pulled a song from the animated Transformers and used it in Boogie Nights. And I've always thought about how many people have seen both those films to get the reference.
Yes.
And I have been obsessing far too much over Matthew's question about had anybody done sci-fi crime drama before, and the only thing I can pull up is Soylent Green, and that just that feels like a totally different genre than Blade Runner.
Yeah, but really... I hadn't even considered it. Those would be two interesting movies to compare.
Yeah,
because obviously they both explore a certain dystopia, a cheapness to human life, where Soylent Green is very much fixated on death, and including, it's got a magical scene where Charlton Heston's buddy actually goes through his basically assisted suicide.
Yes.
Which is still fantastic. Blade Runner is, I guess, for me, and Eddie may obviously feel free to disagree, very much about birth, life. Well, what is life more than what does death amount to?
I mean, I think I make the argument that both films are ultimately about the commodification of human life. It's
certainly
just that in Soylent Green, humans turn to people, whereas in Blade Runner, it's the recognition that these robots effectively are actually themselves alive.
Yeah. Soylent Green never actually comes to the conclusion that these people are worth saving.
Right.
It kind of says, well, this is the system you're stuck with, and ends up with Charlton Heston breaking down. There's people. It feels like a Twilight Zone episode.
It absolutely does.
More than a complete narrative. It's still very good.
Same as Planet of the Apes. It all hinges on the last minute and a half of the film.
To my mind, like it just popped in there, 1984 is kind of the midpoint of those two, of the Soylent Green and the Blade Runner, almost kind of in terms of going from life death to, what is the life control and the free spirit back into the Blade Runner exploration.
Right. And I'm trying to remember. I think Brazil came out after
85.
Yeah.
Okay. So that probably was more inspired by that kind of thought-provoking sci-fi.
Yeah, I mean, it still has Blade Runner elements.
Sure.
And I love Brazil. I think it's a fantastic movie. But I kind of feel it almost pushes too far into an area that audiences aren't prepared to stomach. Whereas Blade Runner, obviously, a lot of the movies we talk about, Matrix accepted, weren't smash hits immediately upon release. And I'm pretty sure Brazil wasn't.
No.
But I guess that's why we write essays about these things, so that they can get critically reappraised and you can say, oh, wait, Flash Gordon 1980 was, in fact, better than Star Wars.
So it's interesting if you go back to the Metropolis, things audience can't stomach, the likes of Metropolis. I mean, that was, as kind of one of the original science fiction movies, that was so far so extreme. I mean, that's more like Brazil, I think, than any other movie. And it's interesting to see that kind of, you could argue that that's almost where science fiction cinema had its vicious and uncomfortable origins, and then you're kind of leading it through. It was more visceral than thought-provoking, but perhaps thought-provoking because it was visceral in the way that Brazil echoes that to a degree. I think and then you have the not muted, but the more acceptable kind of provocative in between, I guess.
Right, and it's interesting that this book follows from horror, in the sense that we expect horror films to make us uncomfortable. So if a horror film makes us uncomfortable, it's great. But then you start getting into you're not making me uncomfortable in the right way. But ultimately, you want to be in that discomfort zone. Sci-fi, like you point out, constantly ping-pongs between we have to be very socially acceptable, fun action adventure, but then it's going to always cycle around to thought-provoking and uncomfortable because it raises uncomfortable questions. And then it pretty quickly has to be pushed back into that acceptable zone. So, I mean, if you look at the Star Wars Flash Gordon thing, that's peak. It has to be fun adventure. And then 82, we're getting into, okay, can it be thought provoking? But then, in the late 80s, you're getting, again, action film, sci-fi, where there's interesting stuff, but it's kind of hidden in the margins. And then back to Matrix, where it's like, okay, but what if we did both? And that's kind of where the big shift happens there. It's okay, you could do both. So you could have a cool movie about people shooting each other and being cool action kung fu people, but also, Platonian philosophy.
Yeah.
And if anybody's keeping score, I snuck off and did a quick scan of the table of contents for subversive sci-fi, and a quick run through. I can find RoboCop as our entire list of films that did not disappoint or outright flop at the box office. So,
wow. Okay.
So we are doing a lot of advocating in this book.
Did someone cover RoboCop? Because that's another one that's really
yes. My good friend Ethan Parker, who got me started on this wayward life of podcasting, did a good job on RoboCop he makes so many great points, but the one I love the most is how our culture got from an idea of somebody coming back from the dead and saving us from being a guy who works miracles and preaches peace to a guy that just cybernetically kills people.
Wow.
And shoots them in the groin. Like what happened to our culture that we changed the myth so radically? So it's a very impassioned piece, and another thing I can't wait for people to see.
I think you could do a whole book on Paul Verhoeven's movies. Maybe miss one notable exception.
I call dibs on striptease.
Okay. Showgirls. That's
striptease. Yes, you're right.
Hey, that's a classic.
it is for some reason. Probably for the same reason Flash Gordon should be. But yeah, I think there's a lot to sing the praises of in Paul Verhoeven's catalogue, even if his raison d'etre is to keep hammering us over the head and say, you do realize fascism is bad. It is manipulating you, and the fact that you're cheering for these characters means you're bad as well. Unfortunately, that subtext, as bold as it is, does seem to fly over the head of a lot of the audience who just blithely watch Starship Troopers with a big old smile on their face.
Yeah.
And don't read the book afterwards, which is very clear in the book.
Yeah. Well, as we're winding down here, I can't let any discussion of Flash Gordon get by without, if I may modestly throw out my one tiny contribution to the growing field of Flash Gordon scholarship. I am, among my too many hobbies is I have watched in NFL football my entire life. And one of the things that didn't click for me until I was waiting for a game to come on, and I just happened to be watching the Flash Gordon on the Comet channel here in America, waiting for the game to start. And the fact that Flash in that movie plays for the New York Jets, which the Jets are one of the most bad luck teams. I mean, if you ever turn on the news and an NFL team, like their water supply has turned to blood, and like the sun literally no longer shines over the stadium, it's either the Jets or the Cleveland Browns. And I started thinking, okay, at the end of the movie, the New York Jets quarterback, the most important position of the game, is now stranded on an alien planet. And just imagining the Jets fans who are like, prior to this thing, like, okay, we've run out of bad things to happen to our franchise. The day they turn on ESPN or whatever, our most important player is now literally on another planet, and we have no way of getting him back. So good luck.
Well, the reason for all the bad luck is because Ming the Merciless keeps raining hot hail down on
Yeah,
their.
because the whole new
Ming
meaning
is a
to the
Steelers
term
fan,
"go
apparently.
along," Actually, one thing that might amuse you, and I'm sure some of you know, there's an Irish member of European Parliament called Ming the Merciless. He changed his name by deed poll to Ming. He's a pro legalization of marijuana. Is his main platform, and he's a nice guy. He's very kind of liberal, but yeah, he changed his name to Ming the Merciless in order to get some kind of traction on the political platform, to make him noticeable, I guess. But
I'm sure it will earn him a lot of respect.
Amazing.
And Duran are playing here next week.
Not to put my day job cap on and be a political science professor for a moment, but one of the things I love about Brazilian politics is in Brazil, you're allowed to choose how you're billed on the ballot. So it's like very common to go vote in Brazil and like find like 5 different Batman running for the same position. And like, I things that could be written about, how Brazilian politics is trending more in a WWE direction.
Just going down the ballot paper, which one's the Affleck?
Yes,
Affleck, the objectively best Batman.
Yeah. All right, well, let's wrap up. Give you guys a chance to talk about other stuff you're working on. You want to talk about? Colm, is there anything non-secret you want to tell our audience about before we wrap it up here?
Ooh, it's non-secret. A lot of my stuff is NDAs at the moment, which is very surprising. I got three projects of varying magnitude, which are all game-related projects, but they are unfortunately in that stage of NDA. Well, I can tell you that one's a fantasy role-playing game supplement, one is a card game, and one is a brand new, interesting exploration of NFTs and role-playing.
Ooh.
So that's as much as I can tease you with at the moment, without breaking laws and getting bones broken.
Yeah.
All right, Eddie, what are you working on? You want to tell the people about?
Right now at the moment, I'm getting ready for our Onyx Path Virtual Con, which will be this weekend. So we're going to be having lots of panels for that. I'm going to be running a game of Squeaks in the Deep, which is our mouse and rat supplement for Pugmire, involving psychic mice. So if you ever want your Basil of Baker Street fantasies fulfilled, this is definitely the supplement for you. And aside from that, I'm kind of in the same place as Colm. I've got a whole bunch of other stuff that's like super secret, but should be coming out in the near future. So I'd suggest people swing by my website, pugsteady.com, and there'll be updates there.
All right. And Matthew, all of us lifelong Hammer Films fans have to ask what you're up to.
So I'm likewise participating in Onyx Path Con this coming weekend. I will be running a game of They Came from Camp Murder Lake, which is still my favorite name for a slasher movie to take
established
place.
by Mr. Murder.
Yes. Where I fully intend to have a scene before all hell breaks loose with the stepfather character with his big mustache going up to what the dejected child and saying, "Hey, champ, you want to go out to the yard and throw around the pigskin? Listen, kid, I know you don't see me as your pa yet, but I'm hoping that one day you'll get to see that I love your mother very much. And I know she's a troubled lady, but..."
You forgot the fact that the stepfather is making football analogies while wearing a baseball mitt.
Yes, he's wearing a baseball mitt. And he will stand there in the doorway looking forlornly at the stepson before walking off. The stepson will then look up. Now, what will happen later in this game/movie is all the kids will be out at camp, of course, where people are getting murdered. We will see the stepdad pull up and he'll shout out, "Hey, you forgot your lucky button," or whatever, and the audience, the players will think it's the lovely stepdad. He's come to save us. And just as the kid's running over to say, "Dad," and it's the first time he'll call him dad, "there's someone here trying to kill us," stepdad will get skewered in some way. That's the emotional heart of the splash movie. But all that aside, if people want to play this game, they can look up They Came from Camp Murder Lake. It's very easy to find with a name like that. And they can look up all the other games I work on MatthewDawkins.com. There's a lot there to choose from. Use the links on the website, and I get some money from it. So
Ooh. Yes, and the perfect segue. And speaking of money, thank you all for everybody who's donated to the Subversive Sci-Fi Kickstarter so far. And if you're just learning about us or you're already on board, thank you so much. And we would appreciate you spreading the word about that. And okay, I'm going to hit a button I have never hit before, but they tell me that like, oh, look at that! Yes, there we go, and there is the link. Yes. Yes, and then what a great way to wrap up today's episode of McG Learns How to Use Technology. All righty, but thank you, Colm, thank you, Eddie, thank you, Matthew, for being a part of this and for making everything at Ghost Show happen. Being able to work with talents like you, it's an honor and a joy, and I'm so happy that you let me boost the signal on your guys' talents. You guys make it happen. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, thank you as well. Yeah, it's a pleasure.
And thank you all for tuning in. We're shooting to do another Ghost Show this Sunday night, the 12th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and still booking guests for that. But we look forward to seeing you then. And all right, and here we go. Here's the awkward waiting for the podcast to actually end moment here.